our top story today, protests in China against COVID restrictions which erupted over the weekend appear to have died down as authorities begin clamping down. A heavy police presence has been reported in several cities and gatherings were subdued or failed to materialize. Reports have emerged of people being questioned and their phones searched. But overseas Chinese have continued protesting in at least a dozen cities across the world. Meanwhile, Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the golden era with China is over. Our chief correspondent John Cookson has this report.
The arrests of brave protesters continues apace. A heavy police presence is seen on multiple roads and intersections in Shanghai as the Chinese government work to stamp out widening dissent over political freedoms and an end to COVID lockdown. Chinese police patrols order citizens to delete the contents of their smartphones. Officially, Beijing doesn't even acknowledge the protests ever took place. The wave of unrest in China has sparked demonstrations around the world. Student activists and dissidents have held rallies in major cities. This was Melbourne in Australia. Around 100 people gathered in Washington to call for greater freedoms in China and to mourn those who died when a blaze tore through a building in the western city of Urumqi last week. In London, in his first major foreign policy speech, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, whose Conservative Party was once in favour of close trade ties with China, said things were different now.
We also need to evolve our approach to China. Now let's be clear, the so-called golden era is over, along with the naive idea that trade would automatically lead to social and political reform. But nor should we rely on simplistic Cold War rhetoric. We recognise China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests. A challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism. Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further, including by assaulting a BBC journalist. The media and our parliamentarians must be able to highlight these issues without sanction, including calling out abuses in Xinjiang and the curtailment of freedom in Hong Kong.
While muted protests continue in Hong Kong, has the Chinese government listened to the demonstrators calling for a loosening of COVID restrictions and demands from Western governments to ease up on human rights abuses? In a country still ravaged by COVID, it's a dilemma for the regime of President Xi. We'll know the answer in the coming days. John Cookson, Arise News.
And John Cookson joins us now from London for more. John, good to have you. Great report there. You're monitoring events in China, of course, and what are you hearing today?
Hi, ladies. Great to be on Newsday. Well, things have definitely quietened down somewhat. That's not to say that there aren't tensions on the streets of cities like Beijing and Shanghai, Wuhan, and elsewhere. But there's clearly, from those images you've seen in my report, a big police crackdown. I've seen images on social media of police checking mobile phones on subway trains in Beijing, checking what people have filmed in the last few days, and for sure, those brave, and I call them brave protesters because in normal times they would not go on camera and criticise the government. That would mean jail time for those protesters. They were brave to speak out in front of international cameras, so that images reach people like us here at Arise News, and we can show the world. Those kind of people are being rounded up, and they're very easy to identify because they've given television interviews to people, international news agencies like our partners, Agence France Presse and Reuters. So all of those people now are being questioned, and there has to be concern for their future. As for the government, it's in a real dilemma, wondering whether to change its zero-COVID policy. Other countries close by, including South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere, have relaxed COVID restrictions, but China is remaining rock solid for the time being.
And on that note, how likely is it that President Xi will change the COVID policy in China?
He's got a big problem, and the reason why he's got a big problem is that China is a country of 1.5 billion people. I mean, it's a huge country, and the take-up of the vaccine has been patchy at best throughout the country, especially amongst older Chinese people, and the chance of when they loosen restrictions of thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of people dying from COVID, it is absolutely huge. And Xi has staked so much political capital on his zero policy of shutting down restaurants and city centres and whole areas of the countryside. Up to 10 million people are currently locked down in China at the moment. So it's a real dilemma for President Xi to work out.
Well, John, according to British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the golden era with China is over. Now, what does that mean exactly?
Well, wind back the clock to 2015 when President Xi was invited on a state visit to the UK, and the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, even took Xi to a pub in Oxfordshire and bought him a pint of beer. Such was the reaching out, if you like, to China from the UK. Here we are, 7 years later, when the world has changed, and Sunak, who on the campaign trail to become Prime Minister spoke about the threat of China. Last night he softened his words, saying that China posed a systematic challenge. He didn't use the word threat. So things have really changed, and in the last half hour, the Britain's policy of using Chinese company CGN to construct or extend a nuclear power station in the east of England at Sizewell, that's been cancelled now, and a French company, the contract's gone to a French company called EDF. So that's a stark example of how things have changed, how the relationship between the UK and China has evolved for the worst. The idea of the UK back in 7 years ago was that trade ties would help bring about change in China from an authoritative regime. Well, that just hasn't happened. President Xi is a strong man, certainly in China. Politically, at the moment, he's just been made president for life, in effect. So nothing has changed in China as a result of countries like the UK trading extensively with Beijing.
Now, when we think of the history of protests in China, Tiananmen Square massacre is still very fresh in our memories. Yeah. How do you think this particular situation will develop and following the crackdown on these demonstrations?
Yeah, well, Tiananmen was 33 years ago and involved essentially thousands of students in Beijing in particular rising up against the regime, and comparisons have been made. And certainly the recent uprisings in China are the biggest since the Tiananmen Square semi-revolution, if you like, which was brutally put down by the Chinese authorities. Much depends on what President Xi does in the coming days and weeks, whether he tweaks his COVID policy and loosens things up for people who've been effectively locked down for 3 years and are totally frustrated and are concerned about unemployment and political freedoms? Or does he maintain the zero policy idea for China? So really much depends on what President Xi does, as I say, in the very near future, as to how the people will react. Has these incidents recently sown the seeds for political revolution in the future? Too early to say.
Well, John, a brief follow-up, based on the question I asked you earlier about the British Prime Minister saying the golden era with China is over. Just wondering how much support he has from Britons regarding this stance.
Well, in recent years, we've had so many stories in the British media about how the way that the Chinese have infiltrated computer systems in this country, and although one spoke donkeys years ago, decades ago, about the yellow peril, the threat from the east in the UK, there's certainly been an element of that in British media in recent years, and justifiably so in some cases, because Chinese interests in this country are huge, and it's always said that the Chinese use London as a money laundering centre, as do other countries. So the threat from China, in the public's opinion, is, I would say, very real, and this pronouncement from Rishi Sunak today to say that the Chinese were a systematic challenge to the future of the country, I think people will absorb that, and it will bolster their feelings about China, or their anti-China feelings, I think.
Now, as we round up, I hate to bring in conspiracies, but when the pandemic kicked off, China was the beacon of how to respond to a pandemic, and this is where we are today. Is there anything more that's going on within the nation than what meets the eye? Because it seems this is no longer about COVID.
Yeah, you may be right, and the Americans have spoken about the Chinese threat. The British have spoken about the Chinese threat. Sunak's statement today. I find it hard to believe that there aren't so-called foreign elements working in China to not join forces with the protesters, but certainly to give them support, maybe internet support, maybe financial support. The Chinese claim that there are foreign influences working in China at the moment, so that wouldn't surprise me at all. The West also has to see from these demonstrations against lockdown that if a country like the UK faces another pandemic and institutes a similar full lockdown on the country, these are the kind of incidents that a UK government, or indeed any other Western government, could face, with the people saying enough is enough. We don't want to be locked down anymore.
Nicely done. Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, live from London. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. We appreciate your time and analysis as always.